All right. So one of my favorite talks tonight, and this is fun because it's different than your typical creation talk where we talk almost exclusively about the evidence from biology or geology or biochemistry or astronomy. When I've spoken in churches over the years, I've noticed those things are important, but one of the big issues with the typical Christian in a typical church is they're part of the world. We're in the world, but not to be of the world or think like the world. And constantly we hear about the Egyptian culture goes back 9,000 years as absolute definitive proof because we've got all the documents and the manuscripts and the pyramids and the archaeological evidence. And, the Native Americans are here because they came over the Bering Straits, and that happened like 12,000 years ago, and carbon dating is giving the 10, 15, 20, 30,000-year-old dates. And it's all definitively promoted as absolute fact and reality. And all of it undermines what God has to say as the history of humanity, that all of us arose since the flood of Noah. All of us are closely related to one man and woman, Noah and his wife on this planet, and the three sons and all the different human variations spread out from there. So, and I'd never kind of figured it out myself. I'd never sat down and say, how does the Chinese and the Egyptians and the Incas and the Aborigines and the Inuits, how do all these people groups fit into a 4,500-year human history? And I spent 2 years writing the book. Mike held it up. It's called Brilliant, Made in the Image of God. And the more I studied it, the more astounded I became at what I found. And this lecture follows the same pattern of what I learned when I wrote that book. And 2 of my 18 sessions on The Rocks Cry Out deal with this issue because I think it's so important to support a biblical worldview of history. Now, this is kind of our model that God gives us of what is reality, what is factual history. The greatest historical revisionism in the universe has went on for the last 200 years in Western civilization when we've replaced the actual factual creation of different kinds of life in the entire universe in a period of days about 6,000 years ago, death being here because of our actions. That's why it exists, not because there's been billions of years of it. A worldwide flood that made the rocks and the rock layers and the fossils. And the topic now is all these cultures. How do you fit the cultures into a biblical time frame? And there's lots and lots of evidence. Now, before I jump right into it, you'll notice the title, Made in God's Image. And I've got a whole sermon that I'm not going to give tomorrow morning because it's a whole kind of a different topic, and I'm covering a lot of it today. That without a doubt, there is something unbelievably precious to God about every single human being. And part of this gets back to his timeless nature. God is outside of time. It says, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty who was and is to come. It's like God is not part of the physical box of the physical universe, so he's outside of time. It's like he exists in the past, the present, and the future simultaneously. And he said this 4 times. Scripture emphasizes something with repetition. The more it's repeated, the more important it is. And you'll notice I started holy, holy, holy. God's holiness, his justice is really, really important. But there's something else he said 4 times. And I'm just going to read it, and you can count with me. At the end of Genesis chapter 1, and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have the dominion over creation. And jumping down to verse 27, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So it's really, I don't think we can even begin to fathom how much God loves us. And at the end, I'm going to come back to that. How are we made in God's image? And what's the consequences of knowing that? But what we're going to do, we're going to start by just looking at how the world looks at things. And we've done this throughout the sessions today. And then how the Bible looks at things. And how man looks at things is we've got to explain everything without God. And it's an escape of accountability. Now, here's one possible viewpoint. And it's what's in all the schools, all the textbooks, all the museums, the internet. It's everywhere. National Geographic, cover after cover, decade after decade, it's promoted. We found some ape-like skull that's not like every other ape, so it must be an ape turning into a human. And I've got a whole lecture on that. Now, I'm going to be a little interactive in this lecture because it just makes it more fun for everybody. People who have been watching movies, cinematographers, critics, Hollywood experts, since the 1930s, when silent movies were first being made, they have been doing polls and doing critiques of what are the most influential movies. Now, movies are influential for the same reason Jesus told parables, because storytelling sticks. And movies are a whole nother level up of storytelling because they involve stories, they involve drama, they involve visual images, they involve emotions, they involve music, and it's all blended together. And there's been a movie that's been called the most influential science fiction movie ever made by the Hollywood critics. Any guesses? And by the way, if you've watched my video and you know this answer, don't answer. But any guesses? What's the most influential science fiction movie ever made? Any guesses? Come on, interact. Planet of the Apes. Who all watched the Planet of the Apes? Love this older audiences when I get to... We all remember those guys, Rodney McDowell and Charleston Heston dressed up in monkey suits. Nope, that's not it, even though I think there were about 26 of them. But yeah. Other guesses? Way in the back. Star Trek. That was my favorite growing up, starting with the TV series that led to Star Wars and all of those, but neither one of those were picked as the most influential. Kind of interesting. It's one I watched, and it's not one of those ones you would have thought impacted the thinking of tens of millions, but it did. It was called 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now, I'm going to show you a little clip. The interesting thing about that movie is, for the first 10 minutes, there was no dialogue. Nothing but a bunch of ape-like creatures just running around and screaming and throwing sticks and hurtling at things at each other and sleeping in caves. And then in the pinnacle moment of laying the foundation of the movie, they show like this alien monolith artifact that has been placed on Earth, giving this monkey an original idea that it would have never thought of by itself. Watch the little build-up to this whole movie, the foundation that's been laid. So here is great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa, okay? And Grandpa is hungry. So he's kind of digging around in this buffalo bones that have been found, kind of looking for some food. There's this alien structure. Oh, here comes the suspense. The music has started, so you know something good is happening. Grandpa just had a thought, and he's going to reach out and grab one of these bones. Don't you feel it? Something exciting is about to happen. So he's looking at it, and he's going to reach out and he grabs a bone. Yep, hunts a little, there it is. He's pulled out a bone, and he's looking at the bone. And he's thinking, his little monkey brain, when I swing the bone, it makes another bone move. This is kind of fun. It's the bone again. Some more bones fly up. Back and forth he goes. And the harder I swing, the more the bones fly. What could I do with this bone? So he figures out if he swings it really hard, it could hurt. And he can pound things. And he can smash things. He could even hit an animal on the head with his bone. Way to go, Grandpa. He could use it as a tool. Mankind has discovered how to use tools. It is great. And then he throws the bone up in the air. And the movie fast forwards 10,000 or 100,000 years. And they show us heading off to Jupiter in a spaceship. Discover what these alien structures are. Okay, Now, why is that the most influential film ever made? Because it, in just visual, original narrative and cinematography, reinforced everything the kids are being taught in school. And it was probably influenced them more than the textbooks, because there it is. That's how mankind learned to use tools. But there's implications. If that is true, then the further back you go, the less intelligent people were. They had less building abilities developed, less language. There were grunts and screams and screeches that somehow were given meaning to be turned into words eventually. Their social structures would have been less developed. No cities, no brewing beer, no planting farms. Their inventiveness should have been less developed, if all that's true. And over time, as we dig through the rock layers, we ought to see more and more smart people. But it leaves out the other possibility that we were created. We were made in the image of God. Therefore, from the very get-go, human beings were highly intelligent and highly innovative and highly creative. So this presentation for the next 40 minutes focuses on mankind's knowledge of those early biblical events. Remember, Adam and Eve walked in the garden with God daily. What do you think? They walked there in silence and never communicated? No, God was telling Adam, what would be your first question? Where did I come from? I'm just here. God would have been explaining these things to Adam and Eve. And then Adam would have told his children. And Adam's children overlapped with a lifetime of Noah. Noah was able to talk with Seth because of the lifetimes we have in Genesis. So Noah was not stupid. He would have taken documents and information and technology from 1,600 years. Imagine how much you could learn and develop if you lived for 900 years, building knowledge upon knowledge and information on information. You would have had highly advanced civilizations across the earth in that amount of time. And by the way, cultures developing after the flood that had access to that information should have been highly developed, and cultures that information was kept from them. Imagine you being picked up and dropped in the middle of the Amazon jungle. You think you could next week build a computer, an automobile, a refrigeration system? You'd be lucky to survive eking out an existence. So you're going to have a huge disparity of different human cultures living at the same time, trying to survive after the flood. Now, the book in this presentation walks you through eras of history. And the first era of history would have been from the time of creation until the time of the flood, about 1,400 years of human history. Now, this flood, if you've been listening at all, pulverized this planet. Did you hear Michael Ord and Kevin talking? What is it? You said 5,000 meters of sediment? Like 10,000 feet of sediment after it had been laid down, being washed off of continents. Nothing survived. There were no pyramids before the flood. The pyramids are made of limestone, and limestone formed during the flood. Nothing survived. But the whole world was deluged and destroyed. There would have been memories of pre-flood events. Noah would have told his kids would have told their kids. After Babel, they would have spread out. Some of these things would have been remembered, increasingly distorted. Noah had 120 years from when God warned him a flood was coming to build the ark. He's called a preacher of righteousness in the New Testament. It means he was trying to get people to see the truth, to quit living in fantasy land of sin. And by the way, I agree with Kevin. I think there was all sorts of weird genetic issues going on before that flood. And the Bible tells us that. Noah was righteous in all of his generations. That's talking about genetic stuff. And after the flood, there would have been rapid civilization rebuilding. But he would have taken documents with him. He would have taken information with him. It would have been a wide variation of skills. Now let's look at a couple examples of that. We have found in China, or the Chinese had dug up, back in the 1970s, an enormous 12-foot tall cast bronze sculpture of a tree. Okay, they've just dug it out of the rock layers. Now, they estimate it's about 4,000 years old. I think in this case, they're pretty doggone close. That's probably when, about 400 or so years after the flood, civilizations are rebuilding. And I'm going to talk about how fast this could happen as we move along. And they put it in a museum. There's a whole museum in China that centers around this really significant archaeological find. Now, here's what's on this tree. It's 12 foot tall, cast out of bronze. Here's a civilization starting to develop from a one people group of one language after they spread out after Babel. And there's something this culture wanted to make sure future generations never forgot. And they built this 12 foot tall bronze tree to commemorate this event. On the tree, you have leaves that are shaped like knives. So they're kind of like, here's a close-up of what they look like. They kind of come to this sharp point like a knife, and nestled among the tree is a fruit. So it's kind of like a dangerous fruit or a forbidden fruit on this that would be the symbolism. At the base of the tree, there is a snake coiled around the tree. Anybody notice anything familiar going on here? You got a forbidden fruit with a snake at the base of the tree. He's kind of a vicious-looking character with these mean-looking teeth. And by the way, this snake still has legs. And by the way, we've found snake-like creatures in the fossil record that still have legs. And last, you have a human hand reaching, here's a picture of it, reaching toward the fruit. It's got 5 fingers, a thumb, knuckles. So you have a human hand reaching toward forbidden fruit with a snake at the bottom of the tree in a 4,000-year-old bronze sculpture in China. Think about this. This is reality. This are the Chinese people. If the next generations forget nothing, they don't want them to forget why sin and death exist on this planet. Because of our actions, rejecting God as the one in control, setting the rules, and us wanting to make our own rules. At which point we're sinful, God's not. He has to judge us, or he's not a holy, holy, holy God. And he started the process whereby he would ultimately take that judgment upon himself as a factual, actual event of human history. And there it is in the Chinese record. And while we're in China, think about written language. Supposedly, written language came from ancient, ignorant, ape-like creatures eventually starting to assign meaning to symbols. And then, you would think it would be really, really simple. Well, China is one of the oldest cultures in the world, historically, archaeologically. They grew that's why the population is so large, is because they've been around from the very beginning after Babel. And they started writing enormous numbers of symbols that were really, really complex. And they would have these little marks that would mean certain things, like this first one means anger, the second one means diarrhea, which means you really need the third one, which means toilet, and so on. But they were really complex. As a matter of fact, these guys, and the earlier ones were written on whale bones and stuff, they had 80,000 symbols in the original Chinese language. 80,000 of them, each one meaning a different thing. Now imagine singing the alphabet song to your child at night to put him to sleep. 80,000 letters, each one having a meaning. But the interesting thing is, Edith Nelson was a missionary, and she wrote 2 books starting clear back in the early 1900s up until later, where she showed how these symbols carried the original occurrences and things that were happening in the Garden of Eden. And the people of China knew these things. For instance, the symbol that the Chinese have that means garden, and let me just skip on ahead, looks like this. It's a rectangle with a little K-like symbol, and then it's got an upside-down T inside of it. Well, that upside-down T is their symbol for dust. The little square underneath of that is the symbol for breath or life. The K means 2 people, and the rectangle is a symbol for enclosure. So dust given breath created 2 people inside of an enclosure. That means a garden. Isn't that astounding? There is no possibility that's just some weird coincidence. These people knew about the Garden of Eden, and their word for garden incorporated what happened there. God created man. Their symbol for boat is the individual symbol that means any vessel, whether it carries water or you float on water. Their symbol for 8 and their symbol for breath or people that are alive. So 8 people on a vessel is a boat. Where in history do we find 8 people on a vessel? Noah and his 3 sons, his wife, and 3 daughter-in-laws are 8. Why not 10? Why not 2? Why not 12? Because it's actual, factual history that they used and knew about. See, it's not just God's word. He makes the truth known worldwide through these various cultures. And while we're on the subject of writing, it is just unbelievably creative across the planet. Went from very complex writing. By the way, Mao, when he murdered hundreds of millions and killed all the intellectuals, he decided to simplify the Chinese language. So he took 80,000 characters and reduced it down to a few thousand. So it went from complex to simple, not simple to complex, the opposite of what we would expect. In Peru, when the Spanish came and brought their diseases and wiped out an entire culture, they didn't bother to learn how the Incas, the ancient Incas, communicated. And in the late thousands, about 1,000 to 1,500 years ago, the Incas owned an area that was larger than the length of the whole United States. They had the Inca Highway that went up and down over the Andes Mountains for 2,000 miles with stations posted along the way. They had these things called quipuses. They would take a rope and dangle cords from it of different lengths, and then they would tie knots of them, different knots at different locations, and those are like their letters. The length of a cord might be a letter. The number of knots might be different numbers of letters. The location of the knots might be letters. So the knots, the size, the color, the location would all carry meaning. And you'd line them up and you'd read those letters that would turn into words that would turn into sentences, kind of like our alphabet sentences and paragraphs. They'd roll this thing up, stick it in a bamboo rod. Then they could run runners from station to station. They would run 20 or 30 or 50 miles in a day, hand it to another runner, he would run it, and in a matter of weeks, they could run a message from one end from New York all the way to Los Angeles. The guy at the other end would pull it out, unroll it, and read it like we would read a newspaper. Isn't that cool? No written language. This was the communication method that they developed. Now, those are just indications of the genius of man, their knowledge of early events. There's other examples. But let's look at what's happening next. Right after the flood, and biblically we put that in 3,400 or 4,300, 4,000, 4,400 years ago, mankind's trying to establish a foothold on a devastated planet with continued repercussions of geological movement and all sorts of things going on. A much wetter environment. Now, several hundred years would have passed from Noah and his family kind of hunkering down there on Mount Ararat to starting to have children and starting to spread out. And God said to be fruitful and refill the earth, but we've refused to do that. And instead, we're building this tower, which I think was an indication of not trusting God to not send another flood. Let's build a big, super strong structure so that another flood will survive. I have a feeling that's kind of what was behind it. And there was an ice age raging for the next 500 to 1,000 years. It would have been building up for those first period of time. And this is, well, we'll get back to that in a moment, because there's a real strong clue to the reality of the Bible's narrative as we look at the ice age. And I'll come back to that one. But one of the earliest civilizations to develop, and everybody acknowledges this, was the Egyptian civilization. And it was unbelievably advanced. Now, I had to ask myself as I read God's word, and it puts Abraham leaving, his town, and heading toward Egypt, ends up in Egypt with his half-sister, pretends he's his sister. She's captured by the pharaohs. That's a disaster. They eventually give her back because God brings infertility on their women. But that was 3,900 years ago. If you just follow the Bible's chronology, about 3,900 years ago. That means you only had about 500 years from the flood, and only about maybe 350 to 400 years from Babel until Abraham has arrived in an advanced, highly populated civilization with pharaohs and all sorts of structure. How does that even fit? And I had to trust, does it make sense or not? So I made some assumptions. Until recently, large families were really common. When I grew up in the late 50s, early 60s, I would play in a neighborhood, and there were 4 different families that had either between 8 and 12 children. It was just the norm. You had all sorts of kids running around. It's been a really recent development that 3 is considered a large family. And I had to ask myself, wonder how big families were back farther. My dad had a picture from World War II. He was the squadron photographer in the Air Force. And he had this French family where they lined up 20 kids, where there's it's just like a stepladder going from a little baby all the way up to a kid in her 20s, 20 kids. So I wanted to ask a question. What do you think is the record in documented, historical, trustworthy sources of the woman in recent history, the last few hundred years, who has had the most children? One woman, how many children has she had in her lifetime? Any guesses? 36 is too low. 72 is too high, but you're closer. And I'll just throw it out, 69. One woman, 69 children. Now, she probably had twins and triplets and was constantly pregnant and started early and ended late. But that's in modern times where people aren't living for 800 years. And even with hundreds of years after the flood, people were still living, 500 and 600 years. It wasn't until the time of Job and Abraham that lives had dropped off to about 200 years. At the time of Moses, lifetimes had dropped off to about 80 years. So you see the progression of much less well-protected environment, much more genetic problems, as every generation's a little worse than the generation before. But Wikipedia, which I don't even trust, they document 50 women have 20-plus children just in the last many decades. So less genetic mistakes before the flood, stronger magnetic field before the flood, protecting us better from the sun's radiation, less pathogen mutations before the flood. People lived much longer. So let's just say each couple off the ark had 20 kids over a 50-year period, and that's all they ever had. It may very well have been way more than that, because they were highly motivated to have a lot of children. Well, if Noah landed 4,350 years ago, and within 50 years, each of his 3 kids had 20 more kids, there would have been 68 people 50 years after the ark landed. Well, if those 60 kids paired up for 30 couples, and those 30 couples each had 20 kids, 100 years later, there would be 600 people on the planet. Now, I think there would have been even more, because they would have continued to have kids because they were still living for hundreds of years. 150 years later, those 600 people were pairing up, and now you have 3,000 couples. 200 years later, you have 30,000 couples, plus the original people, about 66,000 people. Now, some of them may have died or been murdered or enslaved, but it's a guess, but it's not unreasonable based on biblical truth. Well, let's put the Tower of Babel right then. So you have these 66,000 people, 30,000 couples. The Bible lists 70 distinct groups that spread across the globe. I don't know if that was 70 languages or not, but let's just say they broke into 70 groups. You have about 428 couples per group. One of those couples end up in Egypt. Okay, so now we're at 4,100 years ago. They each have 20 children. Now you have 4,000 couples. 4,050 years ago, 40,000 couples. 4,000 years ago, 400,000 couples. 3,900 years. By the time Abraham arrives in Egypt, you could have had 42 million people. There's no problem at all fitting an advanced civilization into a 400 or so year time frame after the flood, because there was a way better environment, and people were highly motivated to have lots of kids, and they lived longer. It makes perfect sense. So that whole hurdle is just a lack of understanding of how fast populations grow and what the Bible has to say. And when you look at Egypt 4,000 years ago, it was an astounding civilization. We still don't know how they did the things they did. And I think it's because they brought knowledge and technology from 1,600 years of brilliant, made-in-the-image human beings and what they had learned and developed before the flood. We're just going to look at one thing, the Pyramid of Giza. It is made of 5 billion pounds of limestone that was formed during the flood. Some of it was quarried 500 miles away. It was believed to be completed by almost all Egyptologists, people who have studied Egypt, in 20 years. Because there's a pharaoh who said he wanted to start it as his tomb. He died 20 years later and was buried in it. So you had 2.3 million blocks of stone put in place, cut to exact size, transported, dropped into position over a 20-year period. If you do the math, the number of days in a year, the number of days that would be in 20 years, the number of hours in a day, and divide that number of hours into 2.3 million blocks, you had to get one block into position every 5 minutes. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year for 20 years in order to build that in that amount of time. Every 5 minutes. I don't think we could do that today with all of our technology. They did it 4,000 years ago. Then they covered it with capstones. I really wasn't aware of this, but they put this gleaming marble, which is very white and reflective, and they cut it underneath into a stair-step pattern, and on top it had a sloped surface. So this whole pyramid was covered with a smooth surface originally. And you could see it about 28 miles away. That's how you could still see the peak of it that far away over the curvature of the earth. And it must have just gleamed everywhere you looked. Because during this period of Egypt, it was not a bunch of sand, dry desert. It was very well forested, and there's all sorts of evidence for that. Because the world was much wetter. During the Ice Age, much more evaporation from the ocean, much more rainfall in the equatorial regions, snowfall in the north and south. But to make it all work, they had to level the site. Because if you're building a pyramid on ground that goes up and down over a 14-acre base, you're stacking your blocks and they're getting all out of kilter. So they leveled that 14 acres to a levelness of 0.001 inch per foot of length. That's 1 mil. We have to send metal plates to a computer-driven milling machine in order to get a flatness that flat. They did it over a 14-acre area before they built the pyramid. They had to have surveying type equipment. And they placed it exactly 1/3 of the way between the equator and the North Pole. It's a prime meridian. It's a really important astronomical position. To do that, they had to know the exact diameter of the Earth 4,000 years ago. And they aligned it within 2% of a single degree on the magnetic compass with the Earth's magnetic field. They were only 2% off of a single degree of the compass. Now, that was 4,000 years ago. In 1859, I got to come back to this, we built the Greenwich Observatory in Greenwich, England, 1859, and we tried to align that observatory with the Earth's magnetic field. 1859, we got within 6% of a single degree. At the beginning of human history, we were 3 times more accurate than we were 4,000 years later. So who's more intelligent? We haven't come from ape-like creatures. Mankind has always, from the beginning of civilization, been brilliant. But here's what the evolutionists do, and the archaeologists. And by the way, archaeologists are trained. You can't ever break this rule. You've got, whatever you find, you've got to place that find into either the Stone Age or the Bronze Age or the Iron Age or the Modern Age. So whatever you find, you're going to place it into that construct of history. And they find people who were clearly people called Neanderthals that were living in Europe and often living in caves and having tools, and they have a different physiological structure than us. Bigger bone bodies, thicker limbs, thicker skulls. They actually have bigger brains than modern human beings, more sloped in their appearance, eyebrow ridges. By the way, we can find people that look like that today. I've got pictures in the book of people who have a very sloped forehead and very pronounced eyebrow ridges. And we now have been able to do DNA testing on Neanderthals that were frozen, and most modern Europeans have 2 to 4% Neanderthal DNA markers in their blood. They intermarried with normal human beings. They were just a variation of the human race. And furthermore, they cared for the elderly. They very valuable artifacts in the graves with people that had died. meaning they knew something came after they died. Why would they waste their energy and time throwing away good spears and bows and stuff, leather clothing? Because they knew something came after this life. They brought down woolly mammoths in coordinated hunting parties. And I brilliantly inventive. I found this report when I was researching for the book. In the name of the paper said, Neanderthals invent super glue. I thought, well, this sounds intriguing. So I started to read through it and dig through it. And what had happened, they'd found big old poles buried with the Neanderthals that had great big old stone arrowheads on the front of spears, so they're big. And the rawhide had rotted out, but the stone was still like glued to the end of the wood spear. It was stronger than the rawhide strapping. And they started to analyze it, and they figured out what the composition was, and they discovered it was the sap of a certain tree, like imagine a birch tree with real gooey sap, or a pine tree. And they realized for it to turn into a glue, you had to cause it to be cross-linked and very chemically attracted to both the wood and the stone. And they tried to reproduce it. And they worked and they worked and they worked, and they realized if you heat it too hot, it just chars. If you heat it too long at too high of a temperature, it bursts into flame. If you don't heat it high enough, it doesn't cross-link. If you heat it too long, it cross-links into a solid block. So you have to get it to a real narrow temperature band, and you have to hold it for a very specific time, and then it turns into a real strong adhesive. And they're trying to figure out, how did the Neanderthals do this? And the best they could come up with was, well, they must have buried the resin under a rock and built a fire on the rock and then heated it just the right amount of time. And they worked and they worked and they worked and they kept trying to do it, and they could never get it quite right. Well, the Neanderthals did. So they took modern thermocouples, stuck it in there so they could build the fire and hold the temperature, exactly the right temperature for the right amount of time, and modify the fire while monitoring it with electronic instruments. And then they were able to reproduce the glue. And it's like, success, we did what the Neanderthals did. Except they did it without all of our modern technology. So who's really smarter? See, it has nothing to do with intelligence. We've just built upon the technology of others who were brilliant from the beginning. And these guys are painting gorgeous paintings on their cave walls of animals and herds of horses, and they're exactly duplicating the run and the lift and the gait of a horse, which wasn't even captured until we had modern movies. They're building three-dimensional pictures of prides of lions that's built into the three-dimensional structure of walls, and you find these paintings all over the place. These weren't stupid people. They had time to be artistic and creative. So you have people eking out an existence at the same time you have people developing advanced civilizations because they had access to different amounts of technology. So what's happening for the next 1,000 years? Earth history from 4,000 years ago till 3,000 years ago. It's a period characterized by rapid, massive building projects. And I think kicked off by the Tower of Babel, which the people spread out and they started to reproduce. By the way, we find pyramid-type, juggernaut or pyramid structures all over the world. In all of these ancient cultures, from the Aztecs in South and Central America to Armenia area, where they have huge mounds of mountains that have been shaped and sculpted into pyramid-type structures, to the Egyptians. The Chinese have an area that's off limits where they have dozens of enormous pyramids that have been built early on in their history. And I think that's this throwing back. I really, really strongly suspect the Tower of Babel was a pyramid-type structure. And all these people spread out and started rebuilding them. We had an ice age that was starting to peter out near the last half of that 4,000 to 3,000 year ago time frame. You had Moses sending spies into Israel about 3,400 years ago, and they came back. Remember, they came back with a variety of grapes so big they had to hold it on a pole, and they said that land is a land flowing with milk and honey. It was a green, vegetated paradise. They're always cutting down trees to make temples and altars on top of the hills to foreign gods. Now it's like, without irrigation, it's a total desert. See, there was still lots of rainfall. Now, this is where I get a little bit into Ice Age teaching. Michael Ord is the expert on this, and I think I've interpreted what he's saying, or close to his time frames pretty well. But there's an artifact that's been found called the Pyrrhus map. And it's a map drawn by a Turkish general. And I believe the origin of the information, now not the map itself, but the origin of the information that ultimately led to this map goes back in the 3,800 year ago range, while Egypt's becoming a major power. And the Phoenicians, which were like the sailors of the ocean in these early Earth cultures, were probably exploring the whole world, this restructured Earth with their trips. Now, this map was compiled or actually believed to be drawn in 1513, but it's the information on the map that totally blows away any modern researcher. A possible source of the information that was found on this map could have been the Library of Alexandria, which burnt down about 2,000 years ago. It had 1 million scrolls when it was destroyed. It goes back to the time of Cleopatra. But all that information came from the Greeks, and the Greeks got it, probably went all the way back to Noah and his family. Now, here's what's on that map. It shows the shoreline of Antarctica when it's not covered by ice. Okay, now Antarctica, the shoreline is 100% of the time covered by ice. Some of it's a mile thick and extends 100 miles out into the ocean. And the actual land surface is under that mile thick of ice, that you can never get to because the ice never melts back away from it. Modern textbooks tell us the most recent ice age, and there's only been one, that's just bad interpretation of the ice cores, started about 200,000 years ago and slowly kind of petered out about 12,000 years ago. So no human being has ever seen the shoreline of Antarctica, according to modern science. It's always been covered by ice as long as humans have been around. And yet this map shows what the shoreline looks like. And in the footnotes of the map, that was reproduced with information from way farther back, it says this area of the Earth has a warm climate. Antarctica has a warm climate. How does that fit? And by the way, here's what Antarctica looks like. The land surface is way, way, way back here somewhere under a mile of snow and ice. How could anybody know what that shoreline looked like? But this map shows it. And I quote in the book an Air Force general in the 1960s who examined this map, and then the U.S. Air Force had started to do sonar mapping of the land surface under the ice, and he said it agrees very, very well with what we know the shoreline now looks like. And then he said, we have no idea how this map ever was able to be drawn. They're clueless, no idea. Well, here's a logical explanation. After the flood, with all the volcanism and land movement and all sorts of friction as stuff's being moved around, the oceans had to have heated up enormously. The Arctic Ocean may have been 60 degrees on average. Today, the average ocean temperature top to bottom is probably in the mid-30s, overall average. Well, water holds a lot of heat. It gets rid of that heat by turning water from liquid to vapor. Imagine how long you have to heat a pan of water on your stove to get all that water to evaporate. You're going to pour an enormous amount of heat into it. The oceans would have contained bazillions of BTUs of heat, and it would have taken hundreds and hundreds of years for enough evaporation to cool them down. And that evaporated water is going to come down as rain around the earth for hundreds of years and snow in Canada and southern Argentina for hundreds of years. But things close to the ocean, it wouldn't have built up. It would have melted because the oceans are very, very warm. So for probably hundreds of miles inland of an ocean, you would have kind of a microclimate. Further away from the ocean, in the north and in the south, you would have ice building up. There may or may not have been rapid continental movement. Different creation geologists have different viewpoints on that. Mass extinctions would have been occurring as animals were repopulating and getting trapped behind these ice as it cooled down and the ocean eventually froze over. And there would have been widespread continued sedimentation as rock layers shifted around. So with the increased evaporation, cloudy skies, more sunlight's reflected, you've got an ice age going on. Until the skies cleared and the ocean evaporation slowed, and then that sunlight would have started to evaporate these huge glaciers, building up lakes, carving out the Missoula flood, Columbia River Valley, and so on. Here's a picture of the extent of the ice that scientists who have studied it believe how far it extended. Now, you might have ice miles thick up here, and a mile of ice means there's been 10 miles of snow. We're not talking inches or feet of snow. Over time, we're talking miles of snow. The weight is shoving these glaciers forward, but you'll notice along the shoreline of the Arctic Ocean, there was never glaciers formed. Why? Because until the ocean cooled down, that ice and snow would have never built up and to form glaciers. And the same thing along these coastlines. Now, I'm going to skip past the next couple slides, which talk about how fast ice can build today, but it explains that ice. After the flood, the oceans are warmer, people are exploring the world, probably headed down toward Antarctica. They drew maps, they brought them back. Those maps were passed from civilization to the Library of Alexandria, ended up in the hands of monks, during the Dark Ages, and ended up in the hand of this admiral, and he drew the map. So it's a logical explanation, but it can only be true if the Bible's true. And it all fits together like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. 3,600 years ago, in Peru, they are building monolithic structures, enormous walls with stones that can weigh 500,000 pounds. And we know these stones were quarried up and down over the top of Andes mountains. So they're moving a 500,000 pound stone up over top of a mountain and back down the other side in order to build structures. This is a place called Sacsayhuaman in Peru. And these are built like a jigsaw puzzle. You can't even put a credit card between the seams. They're so tightly fit together. We don't know how they carved the stones. We don't know how they moved the stones. But these are pre-Inca structures. The Incas built on top of these structures. These structures were built before they had a civilization, and enormously. And look at the size of them with people compared. Imagine moving those things, carving them to perfect shapes to fit them into structures. Look at the size of these stones that were placed there. We have burial mounds all through Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Wisconsin that predate any modern Indian tribes. These are considered sacred sites by the more modern Delaware and Iroquois and Navajo Indians and so on. So these were built by ancient civilizations that first came over into the North America area. Well, grave robbers are wondering what kind of treasures are inside of these. So in the late early 1900s, they're digging them up. And there's a researcher named Rudolf Eisenhower who in 1910, and you can still find this book documented on the internet, he documented 31 either copper, because copper is very common in upper Michigan, or slate plates with symbols drawn on them. And I'm going to show you one that depicts a biblical event. Now here's a picture of these guys looking for treasure in these Indian mounds. And many Indian mounds, by the way, are shaped like snakes. This one's in central Ohio. And that goes back biblically. I mean, if you think of sinful mankind trying to escape accountability and rules of God, who freed man from the oppressive rules of God in sinful mankind's mind? It was a snake. Why do all these snakes show up in all these ancient cultures? And they do. Even the ancient Greeks, Athena is always portrayed holding a snake or a snake wrapped around her sword. And you see them everywhere. Here's ancient from Arizona. Ancient Indians in Arizona would often have snake-like structures. But here's that plate that was pulled out of one of these Indian mounds. Now, I just find this interesting. You got a bunch of symbols, kind of like Egyptian hieroglyphics, early culture there, early culture here. You got pictorial views of people drowning in a big vessel with a bird with something in its beak, and then animals and 4 men coming off of the vessel. Now, this is immediately called just a forgery by the academic world. And I don't know, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but we can at least study it and consider the possibility that, oh, wow, here's knowledge of the actual events that happened on Earth history. They can't. They just have to out of hand reject it. In ancient Peru, they were doing brain surgery 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. Brain surgery. And we can find all these skulls. I went to their museums and I've seen them. Here are 2 skulls They have had a hunk of their skull cut out and a metal plate put in. This one's had a gold plate put in. And you can see where the bone has regrown around the hole that's been cut in the skull. And they survive for the bone to regrow. Okay, couple more. Pre-Greece, before Greece was Greece and the golden age of Greece, they had little city kingdoms. We're always fighting each other. And they discovered something that is the national treasure in the National Museum in Athens, Greece. It's because they've only found one of these, and it's so significant. Here's another interactive question. In the year 2000, the turn of a new 1,000-year millennium for mankind, Time magazine always does the Man of the Year. They decided to have all the historians and all the experts in history vote who was the man of the millennium, the most important human being from 1,000 years ago until the year 2000 that accomplished and advanced humanity more than any other human being. Who do you think they guessed? Shout out a few answers. Say, Bill Gates? Why not? I mean, computer software, that's how our bodies run, by software. But nope, he wasn't picked. And he just barely squeaked in, I think, before the year 2000. No, he wasn't picked. Someone who advanced humanity far more than Bill Gates. Stephen Hawkins, I don't think he ever invented anything, and most of his conclusions were wrong, but that's my personal opinion. But nope, he wasn't picked either. Nor was Charles Darwin, yeah. Eisenhower? I like it. Oh, Einstein. That would have been right up there. No, here's who they picked. Johann Gutenberg. He changed everything because what they felt was, for the first time in all of human history, we could take knowledge, cheaply make copies of it, print it, and distribute it so we would have an educated population and knowledge and information wouldn't be lost from one generation to the next. Because books were so expensive, handwritten on linen, which is just recast cloth, sewn into leather books, there was no use teaching anybody how to read. Only the very rich and the very privileged would even be able to afford a book. So knowledge was just lost, and we had an uneducated populace worldwide. Gutenberg figured out how to make typeset, put symbols, letters in a tray, put ink on them, and then run copy after copy after copy to cheaply capture and save information. And it drove the Reformation of Christianity. The Reformation wouldn't have happened because now we could read the Bible for ourselves. It drove the scientific revolution. It changed all of human history. And I think rightly so. He was chosen. By the way, you know the first book Gutenberg printed? The Bible, worth I think about $100 million a copy right now because there's so few of them left. But he didn't invent the process. It was invented 3,100 years ago by the ancient Greeks. They took hardened, fired little symbols in clay, put them into a circular tray, and then pressed soft clay on top of it to make multiple copies of the same information. Exactly the same concept. They invented multiple copies of printing. It preceded Gutenberg by 2,500 years. It was just rediscovered. You know, once it just got wiped out. This one example of it got captured in a burned down home, covered up, saved, and it's now a national treasure in Greece. Technology lost. In Costa Rica, they were carving Texas-sized marbles. And we think it must have been about 3,200 years ago, way before we thought any civilization even lived there. Now, you look these things up, the historians always have some explanation. They say, well, we don't understand it, and we don't have any tools that showed they did carving, but we know people came to Costa Rica only about a couple thousand years ago at most, so they must have carved these things. Well, here's the problem. These things are perfectly circular. They're so common, they're used as lawn ornaments. They found thousands of them. Their origin is not known because they haven't found any tools capable of doing this carving. They're up to 6 foot in diameter, meaning they weigh like 100,000 pounds, or 30,000 pounds, I'm sorry. And they've found these circular spears on islands offshore of Costa Rica 330 miles made of rock that is only found on the mainland. And people a couple thousand years ago, they only had dugout canoes. Think of loading a 30,000-pound marble in your dugout canoe and paddling it 300 miles offshore. Yet you start to get a picture of the technology and the knowledge these earlier people had, and we've just lost all records of them. In Iraq, they had batteries, and Mythbusters had a show on this. It was really cool. They tried to build them, but it's got an electrolyte solution inside of a clay pot with an iron rod, so it's got an anode and a cathode, and it produces an electric current. And they've unearthed multiple examples, and they're pretty sure they go back at least 2,000 years, and it generates a couple volts. And a lot of this ancient jewelry that has this real thin coating of metal, they're not sure how they did it. And one possibility is that they were literally doing electroplating by linking up these batteries a couple thousand years ago. Last example, ancient Greece. Now, I've moved from 3,000 years ago into the 2,000 year ago range, and I've skipped a whole bunch of stuff to keep this into about an hour time frame. But in 1901, they found a shipwreck in the Mediterranean Sea, and it was just this encrusted, coral-encased bunch of gears and junk. And they're looking for coins and they're looking for pots. So they just threw this thing on the shelf and ignored it for 70 years. And in 1971, some university professors decided to get permission to study it. And they studied it for the next 30 years. And they did all sorts of x-ray work, and then they didn't want to destroy it. And they figured out with lots of study that there were 30 or more precisely cast bronze gears, all in very specific positions. And they're trying to figure out, what did they do with this? Because it obviously wasn't a clock. It's called the Antikytherian mechanism. And here's a quote that came out in 2006, okay? A little bit over 30 years after they started the study. They reproduced exactly what they feel like it looked like, and they figure out what the dials on the front and the back would have looked like, because they understood what happened when you turned all the gears together and how the dials would have turned and what they would have pointed toward. And he said, it's astronomy is exactly right, which is a huge clue, what I'm about to show you. And in terms of value and scarcity, this is more important than the Mona Lisa, because they've only found one of these things. Now, here's what they think it looked like. A bunch of gears, and they put plexiglass cases on the front with a dial that you could turn until the pointer pointed to a certain spot. And on the back, there's a series of concentric rings with like coordinates. And this is what it does. You could pick a date, like any time in the past, 100 years in the past or 100 years in the future, a certain month and day, and then you can turn the crank to that date, and when you look on the back, you're going to see that dial on the back telling you the position in the sky at night of the sun, the moon, and the 5 visible planets. You know, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, where you could find them in the sky. It's a computational computer, over 2,000 years old, cast in bronze, perfect astronomy, superb metalwork, intricate design. But we lost all those skills for 1,000 years or more. They're just gone, the next 1,500 years. I mean, think what maybe they had it 1,500 years earlier, and all that got lost too. So here, that's just a little picture of the genius and ability and creativity of human beings back to the beginning of civilization. And it just destroys this whole idea of apes slowly eking out an existence, turning into people. That's fantasy. And where there has been people who have degenerated for lack of knowledge and inbreeding and lack of nutrition, you actually can get all sorts of physical deformations and reduction in human skull size by those processes. So when we find these ape-like creatures, they're not apes in the process of turning into people. They're people who have degenerated for various physical and genetic reasons, and they're just like our bodies wearing out in the wrong way. But when we stop acknowledging that we have a creator, that makes us the arbitrators of truth, reality, and morality. And the most conniving, the most powerful, the most convincing is going to end up rising to the top, often the most evil. And that's the history of all human cultures, because we leave God out. There's no source outside, except for the Declaration of Independence. Where does our life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness come from? Because we have a creator. It's outside of us. Morality degenerates, life is cheapened, every society falls apart. Now, the last page of my book, I do a little speculation. In what ways have we been made in the image of God? We are so distinctly different. There is no other animal remotely close to the creativity of mankind. You know, monkeys and dogs, and they have a certain amount of ability to do stuff, but most of it is instinctive, and even when they're taught something, it's very, very, very limited. They don't paint pictures or portraits or imagine about God or do calculus or invent complex structures. Communicative. All animals just have a very limited grunts and limited communication ability. We assign meaning to symbols to create massive amounts of communication and information and capture it and keep it, and we always have. We have the ability to have compassion. Animals don't have any compunction about wiping out another animal group in order to survive. They just do it. No empathy. It's not there. Now, dogs seem to have some empathy and compassion, but dogs in the wild, they just survive. And last, we've been given choice. Like, we are not ruled by instincts. We can choose right from wrong. We can choose to obey our conscience or reject it, in which case we sear it. And that's what happens. When we stop acknowledging that we've been created in God's image, our creativity turns into pornography and evil. Our communication turns into cursing and degrading and ridiculing. Our compassion turns self-centered into the compassion for us only instead of those around us. And our choices become degraded and degenerated. And that's what's going to happen. That's our natural bent. And that's why Christ had to die for us, because that's what we're redeeming. What's wrong with cultures, what's wrong with our world, what's wrong with all world history is that every human being is sinful at their core. And it's only by the Holy Spirit transforming us that we can fight it. And we still fight it every day. Paul said, why does my flesh do what I know it shouldn't when I desire to do what I know is right? Because every day we have to yield to God's leading. And we're only going to do that when we have His Spirit within us. So all of this comes back to God's Word, why we can know it's true, and just another method of talking to people about how they're being deceived. This whole slow transformation of apes to us just falls apart when we actually look at the advanced creativity, brilliance, and abilities of these ancient cultures. So thank you.